Between the War of 1812 and the Civil War, the United States became an industrialized nation. Advances in transportation and communications, the growth of manufacturing technology, the development of new systems of business organization, and population growth all drove our rapid industrial revolution, widening the gap between the united Northeast and Northwest and the culturally and economically isolated American South. From its revolutionary beginnings until the 1820s, America and Americans relied on roads for internal transportation. Beginning in the 1820s, Americans turned to waterways and canals to connect up their expanding nation. In that previous turnpike era, corn and wheat from northwestern farmers and the cotton and tobacco of southwestern planters had to be carried overland to the Mississippi River and then to New Orleans, where ocean-going ships would eventually take the cargo out to the Gulf of Mexico and then on to the eastern ports or to abroad. The travel was difficult, time-consuming, and expensive, and the movement of goods over water promised faster and less challenging travel. The engineering challenges of canal building were significant, and the financing fell largely to the states. New York began the Erie Canal, construction on the Erie Canal in 1817. It was the greatest construction project Americans had ever undertaken. It was a simple ditch 40 feet wide and 4 feet deep, but the route required hundreds of difficult cuts and fills to enable the canal to pass over hills and valleys, stone aqueducts to carry water, and 88 locks with heavy masonry to permit ascents and descents. 8 years later, the canal opened, and within 7 years, toll traffic was so heavy that the canal had paid for itself. New York and Chicago were effectively linked by the canal. Using inland waterways, New York was soon connected directly to New Orleans by river and canal. Dragged with little resistance by small teams of horses on its banks, crops moved east and manufactured goods moved west at unprecedented rates along the canals, altering markets and expanding patterns of immigration. Other cities on the eastern seaboard lacked access to the waterways of New York, but industrial leaders began to imagine a system of overland travel that would come to symbolize the technological savvy of the American people. By 1804, English and American inventors had experimented with steam engines propelling land vehicles. By 1836, more than 1,000 miles of railroad track had been laid across 11 states. By 1860, 27,000 miles of rail linked up the Northeast. Railroad construction required massive amounts of capital. Some came from private sources, but much of it came from the federal government in the form of land grants. It would be difficult to overstate the impact of the rails on American society. Where rail went, towns, ranches, and farms grew up rapidly along those routes. Shipment time and travel were altered overnight. Travel time between New York and Chicago went from 3 weeks to less than 2 days. The rails were a breeding ground for technological advances, so key to the nation's economic growth. And railroad corporations led the charge toward modern corporate systems of organization. Railroads became an emboldening symbol of the young nation's technological prowess and untapped economic potential. Before the telegraph, communication was entirely physical, which meant all long-distance communication relied on the mail, which traveled first on horseback and coach, and then on the rails. In 1832, an art professor named Samuel F.B. Morse began experimenting with pulses of electricity passing along an electrical wire. He developed a code representing the letters of the alphabet and got Congress to appropriate funding for a telegraph wire linking Baltimore and Washington. The first transmitted message was news of James K. Polk's presidential nomination in 1844. Just 15 years later, 50,000 miles of wire connected the most populated parts of the country all the way out to San Francisco. Those wires ran mostly alongside railroad lines and allowed for easy communication between railroad stations. In 1866, the first transatlantic cable was laid along the ocean floor, and nearly all of the independent lines had joined into one collective organization, the Western Union Telegraph Company. Journalism changed overnight as the wire soon delivered international news in a matter of hours as opposed to weeks or even months. In 1846, newspaper publishers from around the nation formed the Associated Press to promote cooperative news gathering by wire. Even advances in the printing of traditional newspapers, the rotary press, made printing easier and allowed for the mass circulation of daily newspapers that carried yesterday's news all across the nation. Innovations in management, including the rapid shift from individual merchant capitalists to the development of corporations, drove the United States toward a modern capitalist economy in the span of 2 decades. Between 1820 and 1840, laws began to permit a system of limited liability, which individual stockholders risked losing only the value of their investment if an enterprise failed. which helped make possible much larger manufacturing and business enterprises in industrial America. The most profound economic development in mid-19th century America, though, was the rise of the factory. Before the War of 1812, manufacturing took place mostly within households or in small workshops. The factory system, perfected in places like Lowell's textile mills in Massachusetts, organized business operations under one single massive roof. America's industries developed rapidly by the 1840s when the invention of machine tools, the principle of interchangeable parts, and the production of coal revolutionized the manufacturing industries. American inventors came to symbolize the ways in which technological innovations could produce massive change and positive economic growth that could ripple across the globe. Charles Goodyear discovered a method of vulcanizing rubber, and an entire rubber industry was born. Elias Howe constructed a sewing machine in 1846, and Isaac Singer made improvements to it, and the device has since saved billions of people, billions of hours, and billions of dollars. Factories were forced to recruit laborers, sometimes entire farm families, in their early days. Conditions were better than they would later become. In Lowell, Massachusetts, for instance, the young women were well-fed, supervised, and housed in clean boarding houses and dormitories early in the burgeoning system. As competition among textile or clothing manufacturers increased, many mill girls gradually made their way into new occupations, and immigrants quickly became the majority of the factory workforce after 1840. Poorly paid construction gangs made up of increasingly Irish immigrants performed the heavy, unskilled work on turnpikes, canals, and railroads while living in shanty towns along the road. Factories began to pay a piece rate rather than a daily wage to speed up production, i.e. the more widgets you made in a day, the more you got paid. You weren't paid by the hour. Factories themselves were becoming larger, more unsanitary, more crowded, and generally more dangerous. The average workday stretched toward 14 hours, and women and children, whatever their skills and abilities, tended to earn less than the men in the factories. The factory system largely ended the artisanal system of the older Republican vision of Jefferson's America. What we nearly lost in the transition to the factory system was the possibility of economic independence that the artisanal system afforded most skilled laborers. In response to the de-skilling of American labor on factory floors, craft societies of mutual aid began to centralize into trade unions. Hostile laws and courts handicapped the unions, as did the economic depression of the Van Buren era and the steady source of replacement labor arriving daily from European shores. Workers tended to persuade state legislatures to pass laws setting a maximum workday and regulating child labor, though their greatest victory was achieved in the case of Commonwealth v. Hunt. That decision certified the legality of labor unions and permitted work stoppage or strikes as a lawful negotiation tactic. In 1840, white women bore an average of 6 children each, and the death rate in the states was dropping rapidly. German and Irish immigration, long choked off by wars in Europe and economic problems in America, began again in earnest. By 1850, almost half of the residents of New York City were first-generation immigrants. The growth of cities like New York and Boston exploded between 1840 and 1860. And the booming agricultural economy of the West produced significant urban growth in places in cities like St. Louis, Pittsburgh, and Louisville. All of them became centers of growth and trade that connected the farmers of the Midwest with New Orleans, and through it, the cities of the Northeast. After 1830, an increasing portion of the trade traveled through the Great Lakes region, creating new port cities like Buffalo, Detroit, Milwaukee, and Chicago. While foreign-born peoples outnumbered natives in northern cities like St. Louis and Milwaukee during this era, almost no immigrants settled in the South. While Democrats courted the support of these new immigrants, others viewed the growing foreign-born population of the American nation with alarm. Charges of racial inferiority, job stealing, political extremism, and disdain for the Catholic Church dominated the fears and prejudices of nativists, who created formal clubs and societies to combat the growing alien menace. The Native American Political Party, for example, joined with other nativist groups to form the Supreme Order of the Star-Spangled Banner, whose demands included barring Catholics from holding public office, enacting more restrictive naturalization laws, and establishing literacy tests for voting. The order adopted a strict code of secrecy, and their famous password was "I know nothing." Ultimately, members of the society became known as the Know-Nothings, and they staged a political and electoral movement that did well in the Northeast in 1854. The Industrial Revolution had the undeniable effect of making the United States both dramatically wealthier and increasingly economically stratified. Slaves, Indians, landless farmers, and many unskilled workers on the fringes of the manufacturing industry saw their lives improve only marginally during this era, while many merchants and industrialists accumulated enormous fortunes. In large cities, people of wealth built mansions, founded social clubs, and drove showy carriages around New York's Central Park. A significant population of the impoverished also emerged in cities alongside the rich. The urban poor lived on the streets and became dependent on charity and crime, or both, for survival. Some of these paupers were recent immigrants, while some were widows and orphans, stripped of the family structures that allowed most working-class Americans to survive. Some were mentally unstable and some were alcoholics. Still others, mostly Irish and African, were victims of native prejudice, shut out from all but the most menial forms of paid labor. Despite the widening gap between the wealthy and the poor in America, there was relatively little overt class conflict in America. More prevalent than social mobility in this era was geographic mobility. From one industrial town to another, impoverished migrants moved their families for greater opportunities, though they rarely found anything better than they'd left behind. The fastest growing group in this antebellum or pre-Civil War America was the middle class. Once commerce and industry became a source of wealth, the rigid distinctions of old European society, i.e. land-owning gentry versus landless peasants, found its end in America. People could prosper without owning land as long as they provided service and value to others. Middle-class women sometimes could afford to hire a house servant, and middle-class families began to build solid, moderately sized homes. Inventions like the cast iron stove changed the nature of housework and allowed for the improvement of the American diet. The expansion and diversification of American agriculture and the ability of distant farmers to ship goods to urban markets by rail increased the variety of foods available to the average American consumer. As relative American wealth grew, families began to share beds and bedrooms less often. The rooms became more and more cluttered with furniture and other fine household goods. Some middle-class homes even had indoor plumbing and toilets by the 1850s, a significant advance in sanitation standards. Industrialization produced profound changes in the nature of the American family. At the heart of the transformation was the movement of families away from farms and toward urban areas. Income earners were increasingly leaving their homes each morning to work in a shop, a mill, or a factory, and the distinction between the public world of the workplace and the private world of the family first emerged. In the new middle-class family of the industrial era, the husband was suddenly assumed to be the principal income earner. The popular image of the American woman shifted from that of contributor to the family economy to one of a guardian of domestic virtue. Middle-class women learned to place a higher value on keeping an organized domestic sphere or home. Suddenly living very different lives from their husbands, American wives began to develop a distinctive female culture revealed in the romantic novels and women's magazines of the era. The so-called cult of domesticity provided women with greater material comfort, but in many ways cut them off from the external world. So that is, as jobs move, as people stop working out of their homes or farms and start going to factories for work, women tend to stay home, and women and men began spend a lot less time with each other, and we have sort of two different cultures that emerge. A vibrant culture of public leisure emerged as work took people out of their homes. Leisure and relaxation were something to be seized in what few free moments Americans had. Men gravitated to taverns for drinking and talking after work, while women gathered in each other's homes for conversations and card games. For the educated, reading became a principal leisure activity, and books became staples of affluent homes. Theater attendance grew as performances increasingly crossed class lines. Minstrel shows in which white actors wearing blackface ridiculed African American culture became popular, as did public sporting events, including horse racing, boxing, and cockfighting. Baseball, not yet professionally organized, was beginning to attract crowds, as did traveling circuses. Popular American tastes tended toward the bizarre and the fantastic in this pre-war period. In the absence of film, television, and radio, Americans hungered for visions of the unusual, the frightening, and the bizarre. P.T. Barnum's early freak show was populated by little people, Siamese twins, magicians, and ventriloquists, long before he moderated his act by making it a family-friendly circus. Lectures and the thirst for knowledge drove many Americans to churches and auditoriums to hear the latest advances in science, descriptions of exotic places around the world, vivid historical narratives, religious orations, and messages of social uplift, change, and reform. Agriculture moved out of the Northeast with the development of railroads and the commercialization of the East Coast. In the Old Northwest, Chicago emerged as the national center of the agricultural machinery and meat packing industries. and the major industries of the region relied on agricultural products, including flour milling, meat packing, and the distillation of whiskey. The stratification of wealth that afflicted the cities of the East did not similarly poison the rest of the country. With the growth of factories and cities in the Northeast, the domestic market for farm goods increased dramatically in the years prior to the Civil War. Strong economic relationships tied the Northwest to the Northeast, further increasing the isolation of the South within the United States. New agricultural science, including better varieties of seed and better breeds of animals, increased the quality of food products, while the manufacture of steel plows by John Deere in Moline, Illinois, and the McCormick wheat reaper and thresher in Racine, Wisconsin, increased overall crop production. Life for farming people varied greatly from region to region. In the more densely populated agricultural areas, farmers made extensive use of the institutions of their communities, the churches, schools, stores, and taverns. Religion drew farm communities together perhaps more than any other force. Even in areas with no organized churches, farm families gathered in one another's homes for prayer meetings, Bible readings, weddings, baptisms, and funerals. They also gathered to share tasks such as barn raising, crop harvesting, corn husking, and wheat threshing. Women came together to share domestic tasks and to hold bees in which women made quilts, baked goods, and made preserves. Despite the strength of their communities, rural families had much less contact with popular culture and public life than people who lived in towns or cities. Most rural people treasured their links to the outside world, devouring the newspapers, magazines, and catalogs advertising goods they'd never be able to see with their own eyes. And yet most also valued the relative autonomy that farm life gave them. And many rural Americans look back nostalgically on country life once they moved to the city and ceded control over their agrarian patterns of their daily lives. The Northwest, the area around Chicago, and the modern Midwest, was the most self-conspicuously democratic section of the country during this antebellum era. But its democracy was conservative, capitalistic, property-conscious, and middle class. This peaceable agricultural kingdom, this pastoral antebellum in the American Northwest, was the place that gave birth to Abraham Lincoln.